So you still have a solid revenue, declining but solid. Mm-hmm. So it's a chronic problem because you have economic and fiscal decline. That's happening slowly over time. It's like somebody with getting into chronic disease, basically. But the problem with it is you under deliver as you go on. Yeah. And therefore generate social and economic, social and political unrest and discontent. Right. That's why you see the rising trend of what in South Africa is called delivery protests, service delivery protests, because people are saying you are not delivering the services that you promise, or at least your standard of delivery is decreasing, and maybe you're in the UK, your Tony Blair delivery state model is probably what we needed at a point in time. Yeah. But we kind of sharp decline generally in that level, and hence if you look at the number of these sporadic outbursts in different communities, it has been on the increase. It's still continuing. That's why you had what many people call xenophobic attacks now. It's part of the kind of sporadic unrest and so on, that are a demonstration of underlying discontent, social and political discontent about the levels of delivery.
You mentioned in your book that about the time, just before this big twist around 2008, 2009, the Mbeki government was looking at a different approach towards the private sector. They put together a series of papers. That's historically interesting. Could that be revived? Do you think you can see the Ramaphosa government coming up with a new way of working with the private sector, state taking a key role, but the private sector coming in a more constructive way?
I would argue that's the biggest strength that the current president, President Cyril Ramaphosa, has. That's his big strength. He's highly consultative, and I think there's been ongoing engagement with the private sector. Right. He has a forum, CEO's forum, and where there's engagement, and there are possibly issues that are, positions that are emerging out of this engagement. For instance, there is a discussion about an infrastructure fund, and it's not only a discussion, it's now being getting to a stage where it's likely to be implemented and announced soon. And the idea would be that you co-invest with the private sector in infrastructure projects and so on and so on. There's also a broader discussion about how do you kind of partner with the private sector in building and strengthening capacity in state departments and in state institutions, broadly speaking. So there's a lot of stuff that's happening there. But as I'm coming back to the point, our economy needs a shock therapy. To stimulate growth. And
what you call constructive disruption.
Constructive disruption to break the trajectory of decline, as it were. And that, in my view, requires something beyond the traditional. It does require a conversation that starts binding society as a whole in the first instance, behind some common vision, to say, okay, guys, all of us, we have to be seized with the following issues. You don't need a big agenda. You need a few things. But part of it is, of course, dealing with the obvious visa regulations, at least get that thing sorted out. Because particularly just visa regulation in general, but also, open up South Africa for professionals to come into South Africa, because then it also manages the cost of skills, of skills in the country. So deal with the issue of visas as quickly as possible. Look at deregulation of certain sectors of the economy as quickly as possible to allow for growth and development.
Which are the most important?
Look, the telecom sector has a huge potential, clearly. Release spectrum as quickly as possible and ensure that people tie it to an investment program and an investment agenda, as it were. And you agriculture, for instance, I think you do need a package and a deal for stimulating agriculture in South Africa. We've got a lot of JSE listed companies in South Africa in agriculture. Use them to partner with emerging farmers and improve value chains in agriculture, strengthen that as much as possible.
Would that be part of an approach to the land redistribution issue?
It should be part of that. And thirdly, fourthly, I think the issue of education, fast-track skills, in our economy as much as possible, improve education outcomes, because I think the fastest way of taking poor families out of poverty, the poverty cycle, is ensuring that the kids get good education.
Right.
Because then that actually has its own ramification and improvement of their lot. And I think those are kind of things that you should do now. Also, build the credibility and integrity of the state, in state institutions. People need to have a different perception of government and different expectations from government.
Given that all these things that you've said are so urgent, the South Africa has since 94, I guess, even since 90 in a way, built a reputation for consensus building and consultation and so on, trying to be as inclusive as possible. Do you think the situation is now so urgent? There's got to be a sort of, not authoritarian leader, but a very strong type of leadership approach. These are the policies we desperately need to fix things, and we've got to do it now. And those in the party, those in the ANC that are for that, great. If you don't like it, then tough.
You need both, actually. You need both. I don't think it's either or. You do need a very strong narrative coming from government, coming from the president about where we're going. And he needs to drive that and back it up with execution capability. But at the same time, you do need that engagement to kind of start building consensus. You know what, we're so fractious, it's not funny. We're really fractious. We don't agree on anything at the moment, and I think you want to kind of
is it just
step out and
two different poles within the ANC at the moment, or is it just lots of different power centers and arguments going on at the same time?
Again, it's in part, I think you have too many kind of centers and too many strings and too many ideological strands, as it were, on the one side, but also on the other side, I don't think we've put real platforms for solid, substantive engagement in South Africa since '94. I think we don't have. Engagement has always been like almost superficial, so to speak.
I wanted to ask about Eskom as well, because that has seemed to be the key issue on the agenda. We're now 20 months into the Ramaphosa era. Eskom still seems to be deeply problematic. I think we've got until the end of October before the new CEO is appointed. What has gone wrong in the approach to restructuring Eskom? Is it just people are finding out more bad stuff about it? What's blocking progress?
I remember that again. We kind of, when we started that whole process, we had a particular perceptions about the depth of the problem. But I think what you have, remember that the whole executive gone, and a lot of the middle management in trouble. Of different sorts, and of course capacity at the level of generation and in plants, like very kind of poor from what it is. So your first, the first kind of focus was to stabilize the utility.
Right.
And I must say that there's been a lot of work done, and I think new board was put in, quite understanding what the issues are, and with an attempt of the first CEO, but also there's been a real attempt at closing the leaks as much as you can to stabilize the agency. So that work has been done. Secondly, that I think there's now an agreement that you need to kind of change the current model of the utility and separate generation from transmission and so on and so on, and distribution, and so that you kind of, and there's an understanding around that with squealing and complaints, but it would seem to me that most stakeholders agree on that. The second part, obviously, is managing the debt levels. I mean, and there are many people who give you different figures, but I think it's in the region of 500 billion plus minus, as it were.
Wow.
So, how do you stabilize that, and how do you kind of deal with that? So there are a couple of interventions. The first is, I think now many people are talking about taking almost half of that, shifting it into apparently the government guaranteed portion of it, take it back into the sovereign. In other words, you kind of bring it back into government, basically. That actually almost makes the kind of balance sheet lighter.
And it would boost confidence.
Boosts confidence in that thing. No matter and somebody would argue shifting the problem, but I think you can better manage it where it is. Yeah. Once you start doing that, I think you need to just get on to another layer of efficiency improvements. That might entail a lot of stuff. I mean, that means that you might do a couple of haircuts across the system. I mean, that maybe your coal suppliers, you do a haircut, you do all sorts of things. The last bit, I think, look at all forms of co-investment with the private sector in different aspects of the entity. So I think all of those things, and then of course the issue about renewable part of it, renewable energy, and so you can do all of those things. I think my sense is that there is greater appetite to do that now,
because the crisis is so bad.
The crisis is so bad.
And of course there is this ideological opposition to undermining what is regarded as a great state institution in South Africa, the power utility and so on. How strong is that when it comes to any of these reforms? I mean,
that's an ideological problem. I mean, you'll always have that. I mean, but again, I always make the point that in the whole debate about state ownership and private ownership in South Africa and all what I call privatization, or whatever, it's a moot idea. I mean, discussion. That's just like useless discussion,
right?
Because think about it. You have currently a state monopoly called Eskom or whatever,
right?
And probably 80% of its capital investment in any way goes to private sector, because it's private sector that implements. So private sector essentially in the current model gets the benefit without risk. As it were. Okay. So you do need to create a model that actually also shift part of the risk to the private sector. And whilst you have the state maintaining ownership, now what should that model be? And that's the discussion I think that is more constructive in my view than a kind of a...
So sharing the risk essentially.
That's the issue. I mean, how do you do that? I mean, because at the current model, whether you like it or not, I mean, people talk about state ownership for what? Ownership in its own right is not like a big issue. But state ownership has always been an agency for something else. And you're not getting the something else because your 80% of your capital investment goes to the private sector anyway.
Right.
So your argument is like flawed. I mean, for me, the search should be about, and there are many ways you could manage that. Where you say, okay, you continue to own, but let's also have a co-investment strategy. Let's also create a mechanism where risk doesn't lie solely with the state. There's also sharing of risk and sharing of benefits, as it were, between the state and the private sector. And that's the kind of model that you require to have. Now, it does require a bit of thinking, a bit of leadership to get into it, and it does require people dropping old paradigms and really be more pragmatic about the outcomes than they're fixated on these notions. Privatization, I tell you, imagine if we privatized when the Guptas were in power.
That would
be in the West.
Exactly.
So privatization in itself is not a solution necessarily. You know what I mean? And what we need is to look at what are we looking at: improving efficiencies, improving effectiveness of delivery, and ensuring that the kind of cost to the end user is manageable, etc. And consistency of supply when it comes to electricity. And that's what you're broadly looking at, and so on and so on. But also ensuring that these utilities will never get into a situation where you have a monopoly that's held in control away from the where people are supposed to benefit.
The sort of restructuring you're talking about, what would we likely see then in Eskom in the next few years? The public sector, the generating section would still stay in the public sector?
Look, you don't need to increase the private generation in South Africa.
Yeah.
So you don't need to have, that's where I think in generation you could have co-investment with the private sector.
Particularly on the sustainable stuff, the green stuff.
And so on. But also you could have co-investment also